Okay, the University of Calgary is located in the heart of southern Alberta. Both acknowledges and pay tributes to the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Sika, the Pictla, and the Canary First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nations, and the Stoney Nanuq, including Chicna, Bearspaw, and Good Story First Nation. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, District 5 and District 6. Now, moving in terms of introduction, as you know, for those of you that have been here before, we pride ourselves at the Highlander speech talks being able to bring you the very best and brightest in each of their fields. You were able to hear Dr. Hebert talking about artificial intelligence and what it's going to be meaning for development. You've heard Dr. Ferris talking about intelligence. Well, we're very privileged today to have Canada's leading military historian, actually leading strategic studyist for African security. If it hasn't been written, Tim hasn't done it. Anytime I go into his office and I see the encyclopedia series that he has edited, the books that he has done, I'm always very, very impressed on just how much he understands. And the University of Calgary is very lucky, in fact, to be able to call ourselves upon his expertise on African security studies. And so we are very privileged to hear some of his thoughts today on the, once again, he could talk on any part of Africa, and I'm just literally blanking out on specifically which region, but he'll tell you. But there it is up there. Okay, so I'm old and blind. Okay, now that we've established that. And I will also, at the end of this, announce what our next talk is. So without further ado, I now welcome Dr. Stapleton.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm going to stand out here so I can kind of point at stuff on the board there. So I work on African military history, and it's a fairly new field that's sort of risen up in the past 20 years or so as a kind of subset of military history, which is quite an old field, and African history, which kind of emerged in the 1960s. So what I'm going to talk about today is insecurity in West Africa. And I started my career looking at Southern Africa. I was a lecturer in a South African university in the 90s and did a lot of my research then on South Africa and Zimbabwe. But in the past more than 10 years, I've kind of switched focus to West Africa, and I've done research in the Gambia, Sierra Leone, a bit in Ghana, but mostly in Nigeria. And I go to Nigeria in the summers and I help out at a place called Nigerian Defense Academy, giving lectures, helping with thesis defenses, stuff like that. So before I get into this, I'll say that one of the reasons I think why we don't hear much about African current events in media, especially conflicts, is that they're very difficult to explain in just a 30-second soundbite. It just doesn't work. Having said that, tonight I've got about 40 minutes, and it's still really not enough time to cover what I'm going to talk about. So by necessity, I'm going to gloss over some things, simplify some things, and I want to recognize right away that a lot of the issues I'm going to discuss are interrelated, and that might not come out as we discuss each issue separately, but they are interrelated, and we can expand on that maybe in the questions section after. Another thing I'll say as a kind of preparatory message is that I'm going to talk about a lot of horrible stuff, and death, destruction, civil wars, and certainly there's a lot of negative images of Africa out there in the media, and the stuff I'm going to talk about is factual. It's actually happening now. But at the same time, life in Africa is not all hell and suffering. People kind of enjoy themselves there. I enjoy myself when I go there. But of course, there are a lot of problems in African countries generally and West African countries, as we're going to talk about this evening. So I hope that we don't go away from the talk thinking about Africa as just a kind of condemned place that no one should ever go. It is a place with great people and great potential, but it has a lot of serious problems which need serious thought and attention. So, okay, let's begin by a little bit of context. And we could go on with context about this for a long time. But let's look at a map. So here we've got a map of contemporary West Africa with some geographic features overlaid over it. So here we are here on the bigger map of Africa. I think one of the most important things to realize about West Africa particularly is that the modern political borders of Africa were imposed by outside. Largely they were determined in Berlin, in the Berlin Conference, 1884-85, and there was a few adjustments to that later. African people had almost no say in the development of their modern political borders because they were imposed on Africa through colonial conquest in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and then inherited by the post-colonial African states, late 1950s, 1960s, during the decolonization era. And generally, and this is my main point here, the political borders of West Africa particularly tend to take a kind of north-south orientation. There are a lot of countries with coastlines, and then the country's territory extends in the interior. That's because generally colonial conquerors showed up via the ocean on the coast and wanted access to raw materials in the interior. That north-south orientation of a lot of the political borders, going from a coast and heading north in the interior with different strands for each country, that exists in very stark contrast to the physical and human geography of West Africa, which tends to run along east-west lines. So, for instance, West Africa consists of a number of east-west running geographic and even cultural bands. So we see on the coast here, see that sort of dark green stuff? That's the coastal forest, a very thick forest along the coast. And in modern times, people down there tend to be Christians, maybe some traditionalist elements. That's where a lot of the coastal cities are. It's a distinct sort of physical and human geography. Then if you move up a bit, you have another kind of east-west running band right here, and that's kind of a savanna area. So the forest, as you go north, the forest kind of thins out and you've got a more open area with some trees here and there. And then when you go a bit further north here, you get into the Sahel. That's that gray area, which is a sort of grassland area. It's a liminal area, kind of transitional area. And in those northern bands, people are generally Muslims because Islam came from North Africa down across the Sahara Desert like 1,000 years ago. And then, of course, we've got the Sahara Desert, which is also a kind of east-west thing there. So in terms of human and physical geography, you've got these east-west running bands, but then the political modern state borders go north-south, dividing those bands like a cake. So, like a cake has different layers. You cut it, and each person gets a piece with different parts of a different layer. So that's what a lot of modern West African countries are like. So a lot of them tend to have part of the Sahel savanna, part of the forest. So for instance, countries like Nigeria or Ghana and others, in the south is primarily forested, and the people are primarily Christians and traditionalists. In the north, it's sort of Sahelian, and people are primarily Muslims. So in the history of West Africa, of modern West Africa anyway, this has led to some issues around religious, ethno-regional divisions. Because each country has a lot of issues around different types of identities, different types of religions, cobbled together within the one state. And even the states further north, like Mali, which we'll talk about a bit more, even though it's inland and it's far from the coast, it still has representations of each different kind of band of human and physical geography. So, for instance, the politically dominant part of Mali in post-colonial or modern times has generally been the south, the kind of Sahelian savanna zones, and the north, the Sahara part, has been marginalized. But that's actually the reverse of how people in the north see the way things should be. Because back in the days of a trans-Sahara trade, the people who were more northern Mali, and like around the upper Niger Bend, Timbuktu, cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and so on, and even further north with the Tuaregs, they saw people down here in the south as like their potential slaves. They were people who were raided and captured and enslaved. But then in post-colonial times, from 1960 onwards, that's a dominant area. And the north is the marginalized area. So there's sort of a role reversal that happened essentially during the colonial period, which is late 19th century to about 1960. So that's just a little bit of background to show that there's an element of dysfunctionality about West African states because there's a contradiction between the political structure and the human and physical geography. Doesn't mean those problems can't be overcome, but they're also often quite serious. Okay, we're here to talk about conflicts. So I'm going to say a little something about how conflicts are fought in post-colonial Africa. And, a lot of what I'm going to say now is relevant for much of sub-Saharan Africa, but we're going to keep to a West African example. So African ways of war. We're all now seeing war in Ukraine on TV every night, basically. A lot of tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, some air power, drones, things like that. That's generally not how wars are fought in post-colonial Africa. Wars in Africa, in modern Africa, are fought with light infantry forces, people on feet, with light weapons, usually old, former Soviet weapons like AK-47s or one of 100 different variations of AK-47s and associated weapons like PKM machine guns, RPGs, stuff like that. So light infantry with light weapons, small arms. There'll be some artillery, there might be some armored vehicles, but their role is limited. African armed forces and African rebel groups usually don't have a lot of those things. They might have some, but it's not to the extent you might see in wars in, like we're now seeing in Ukraine, that kind of thing. Air power is also present, but limited again, sometimes playing a kind of disproportional role. Because a few aircraft can make a big difference in these conflicts. So generally, there's a kind of disconnect in a way in modern African warfare where you have some kind of high-tech aspects, like the Nigerian armed forces flies drones like that, and they routinely use those drones to bomb the wrong people on the ground, mistaking them for insurgents of different types, though sometimes they do target the right group. And things like cell phones, for instance, are very common. But then the actual fighters in these conflicts, they're generally using old AK-47s, 50, 60 years old. And, AK-47 is an excellent weapon for Africa. It's durable, it's tough, doesn't require a lot of training, it's easy to get, ammunition's easy to get. Excuse me. So it dominates the African battlefield. But with some of the militia forces, you'll get people with weapons like this. These guys are from a Nigerian civilian joint task force. It's like a government-sponsored militia group in northern Nigeria. And because it's a civilian group and they have to use weapons that are legal for civilians to own, and because they don't have much resources, it's a poor area, they're using things like single-shot shotguns, and that actually is a musket. People fight African wars right now with muskets. And they're called Dane guns in some areas. And, you know, in the right hands, it's a deadly weapon. I wouldn't want to be shot with a musket. But, so this kind of contrasts with the high-tech wars we're used to thinking about. You know, there are still people in the world fighting wars with muzzle loading, percussion cap weapons. Like that would be the latest thing in the late 18th century. Essentially you're talking about kind of low-tech conflicts, but deadly nonetheless. Another aspect I'll add here is the proliferation of civilian vehicles, especially in open areas like the Sahel and Sahara. Since about the 1970s, 80s, there's been a proliferation of four-wheel drive pickups, the famous Toyota Hilux, great vehicle, I had two of them, but also Land Cruisers and so on. These are also easy to get, and they have found their way into the hands of rebel groups, really increases their mobility. And the state forces have tended to copy that. So you'll see a Hilux with a big heavy machine gun mounted on it before you'll see a tank or something, because it's not, the tank will not be mobile enough, it's too expensive to keep up, too much fuel, stuff like that. Okay, now I'm going to talk about sort of three different themes in West African conflicts that all overlap in different ways, and they're all kind of going on right now. First is generally criminality. So there are bandits, pirates, smugglers, and there's oil bunkering. Oil bunkering, what's that? I know some people here know what it is. They probably do it, no. Oil bunkering is stealing oil from an oil industry, something like taking an axe or a hammer and hitting a pipeline and putting your bucket underneath and collecting the oil and running away with it, and then refining it in an illegal refinery like that, looks really environmentally friendly, and selling it. So we have to realize here that part of West Africa, especially the Gulf of Guinea area, is an oil-producing area. Most of the oil is kind of offshore oil production or in riverine areas. So theft of oil and piracy and armed robbery at sea around the oil industry has become a problem over the past 15 to 20 years. And it's sort of getting worse because the oil industry creates targets for pirates, which are just really bandits with boats. Oil bunkering, of course, tends to happen on the shore, and it leads to the kind of environmental destruction that has become all too common in a place like eastern Nigeria. So part of the reason people take to criminality in a region, an oil-producing region like the southeast of Nigeria, is that the oil industry, like the real oil industry, operated there for years without any kind of environmental restrictions or rules. And they fucked the place up, sorry. There's oil everywhere. There's oil in the water. There's oil in the land. So local fishing, not good. Farming, difficult, because there's environmental destruction. Therefore, how do people make a living? Well, they may turn to different kinds of criminality, which informs piracy, oil bunkering, things like that. And of course, the security force response to something like oil bunkering can be equally environmentally devastating. So for instance, when the Nigerian Air Force bombs an illegal oil refinery, what happens to the oil? Big explosion and oil goes everywhere, right? So adding to the problems, basically. Kidnapping is another issue that's come up in West Africa, particularly in different parts of Nigeria, like the Northwest, but also centered on the oil industry, and it sort of overlaps with piracy because oil industry workers have gotten kidnapped over the years. But generally, ordinary people in Nigeria get kidnapped. It's become a lucrative industry, and of course, people want their loved ones back, so they pay, and sometimes the government facilitates that, and then you have a kind of local industry developing. And then you get communities trying to band together to defend themselves in the absence of a state forces, and you're talking about very weak, problematic states here. And those militia groups can then become a threat to security themselves. There's an emerging group in northwest Nigeria, up here, called Larokawa, very new one. It started as a community self-defense organization to defend against bandits and kidnappers. It kind of developed into an alternative to the local government and is imposing kind of strict Islamic law on the area. There's already Islamic law in northern Nigeria. Theirs is a bit stricter. And so the Nigerian state has moved in and wants to retake authority from this militia group, which is now kind of a rebel group. I'll also add about the piracy issue that, you know, there was a piracy crisis off the Horn of Africa a few years back, and it's not over, but I think the heyday of it is over. That was comparatively easy to deal with when you look at West Africa, because in the Horn of Africa, you had a failed state, Somalia, and then a massive international maritime intervention, because it's just very important strategic waters leading up to the Red Sea and Suez Canal for international shipping. The West African waters are plagued by piracy, but they're not as important strategically for shipping. They're important for the oil industry. And the issue there is most of the piracy takes place close to the shore or even in inland waters. So technically it's not even piracy, it's armed robbery at sea. Piracy is water banditry in international waters. When you're in a boat and you're going up to another boat and stealing their stuff, and you're in a river, or a waterway, that's armed robbery at sea. It's technically a national problem. And so because these elements of piracy take place so close to the shore often, it's hard for navies to intervene because their ships are too big. That's why the Nigerian Navy is going for smaller ships the last few years to get into the brown water areas, essentially. Another issue related to that is there's a lot of different states in the Gulf of Guinea area. So whereas the international naval coalitions off the Horn of Africa really didn't have to deal with local governments, they could just ignore Somalia because it didn't have a functioning state, that's not the case here. If an international naval coalition operates here, and there are international naval forces there, they have to deal with like 10 different states. And they have to operate very close to shore in the national waters of those states. So it makes it a lot more complicated. Secessionist conflicts, also a big problem. And this relates to the kind of externally imposed nature of African borders that lumped different communities together that really didn't have much in common, maybe had some hostility towards each other before, or, over time kind of fall out with each other. I just listed some of the prominent examples. There are other examples of secessionist movements in West Africa. So These are movements that want to separate their particular territory from the existing national state. So for instance, one of the most famous is the Biafran secessionist movement. So we're talking about Nigeria here. This is Nigeria, and this would be the imagined separate state of Biafra down here. So it's sort of eastern, southeastern Nigeria. This goes way back to the Nigerian Civil War of 1967 to 1970, when the regional government in Biafra tried to separate from federal Nigeria, and the federal military government launched a military campaign to stop it from doing that. And there was a very big, destructive, deadly war in the late 1960s, maybe 1 million deaths or more. Some of the figures are higher than that. The reason for Biafra secession is complex. It has to do with lack of faith in the rest of Nigeria on the part of the people of that region. It has to do with resentment in what is seen as a northern-dominated political system. It also has to do with the oil industry, because in the 50s, an oil industry developed down here in the Niger Delta area. And there was generally a sentiment that, and this will sound familiar because it's like Canada, people in this area thinking that, why is our oil money being spent to develop the poor, impoverished North? We kind of have stuff like this here, although we haven't yet fought wars over it, I guess. And there's a lot more to it. I'm really simplifying here, as I said I would, but generally, Biafra tries to break away. And it's kind of ironic, actually, that oil gives them the potential to be a separate state, but the people in the oil-producing area down here generally were not keen on Biafra. The supporters of Biafra were more in the hinterland, the Igbo people. Might be one or two of them around here. Can ask them about that later. So, obviously, the secession of Biafra was crushed. Biafra was very small, had a very small military compared to the federal military government. Eventually, it's forced back into Nigeria, and there's a kind of national policy of no victor, no vanquished, reconciliation, but it doesn't really work. And when Nigeria goes back to civilian rule after years of military rule in the end of the 1990s, then there's a resurgence of Biafra separatism, like neo-Biafra separatism. First with a kind of movement that wanted to work within the political system called MASOP, Movement for the Actualization of a Sovereign State of Biafra. And the government clamped down on that, so separatists became more radicalized, leading more recently to the emergence of a more radical, violent movement called IPOB, Indigenous People of Biafra, which formed its armed group, the Eastern Security Networks. So there is a sort of low-level insurgency in this area over the past few years, trying to revive the idea of an independent Biafra state separate from Nigeria. And there is someone waving the Biafra flag right there. That's not back in the 60s, that's more recently. And this is a very sensitive topic. I once attended a conference in Nigeria, 2012, and someone had that flag. Someone who was presenting at the conference put a small version of that flag in front of themselves where they were sitting, and just people were very angry about it. So you've also got Ambazonia. Maybe some people haven't heard of that one. It's a little bit obscure. It's a similar separatist movement, well, right here in this part of Cameroon, in the Anglophone part of Western Cameroon. This conflict dates back to World War I. This is an example about how the legacy of World War I is still with us today. So Cameroon was originally, from about the 1880s, 1890s, a German colony. And of course, there was a campaign of the First World War there. Somebody here wrote their thesis on that. And, and it was then divided, like all the rest of the German colonies and the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. It was divided between the victorious powers. It became a mandate of a League of Nations after the First World War, with France taking basically most of the former German Cameroon here, this area. But then Britain was given a sliver of Cameroon adjacent to Nigeria. So basically here, so to be this part. So fast forward to the decolonization era of the 50s and 60s, most of Cameroon, that under the French, became a Francophone state. The little part under the British here became an Anglophone area because it had an Anglophone education system, like the French one had a Francophone education system. So at the beginning of the 60s, there are two referenda held in the British-administered areas. Cameroon, the French one, is becoming an independent state. But the question is, what will happen to those bits administered by Britain? So the people up in the north part, right here, they voted to stay with independent Nigeria, which is an Anglophone country because of British colonialism. But the people in southern Cameroons here, that red part, they voted to go with independent Francophone Cameroon. Big mistake. Of course, they were, false promises were made to them like, yeah, we'll have a federal system and you guys will run your own affairs. Never really happened. So post-colonial Cameroon became a French-backed dictatorship, part of France-Afrique, the continued kind of neo-colonial French empire in Africa. And little Anglophone southern Cameroons there, I say southern Cameroons, that's what the protector, the mandate was called. It's really kind of west. It became this kind of minority, marginalized place. So it's an area where people felt they didn't have their rights, their opportunities because they're English speaking. Now they spoke other languages too. It's a very diverse country linguistically, but we're talking about the kind of bigger administrative, educational, colonial language. So and of course, Cameroon being an autocratic state didn't really care about all these complaints, and eventually, over the past few years, you have an Ambazonian separatist movement in the Anglophone area trying to split off this new state, which the separatists call Ambazonia after the Gulf of Amba, which is the geographic term for that little bit of ocean there. Last example of a secessionist conflict, Azawad. So we're talking about Sahelian and Sahara Africa up here, West Africa. This is essentially the idea that the Tuareg people, an ethnic group dominant in the Sahara region, should have their own state. So historically, the Tuaregs are the carriers of goods across the Sahara Desert. You may have seen documentaries where they're wearing long blue robes and they have camels and camel caravans and all of that. Because of colonial conquest, the Tuaregs were split between different colonial territories and therefore, with decolonization, split between even more independent states. So Tuareg people can be found in northern Mali, in Niger, in Algeria, even Burkina Faso. So from the 1960s, we have the beginning of a series of Tuareg rebellions in Mali and Niger, sometimes just in one, sometimes in both. I won't list them all off. They start in the 60s, they take a bit of a break in the 80s, but then the 90s, 2000s, up to now, they keep happening. And there were Tuareg rebellions against French colonial rule too, so the 1960s wasn't the first time the Tuaregs fought the state in this area. But since about 2000 or so, they wanted to put together their own state, carving off sections of all these existing countries. Of course, the existing countries don't like that, especially since Mali and Niger generally, the political center of gravity is more in the south, and those northern areas are seen as very marginalized. And in modern times, they're the home of important raw materials like uranium in northern Niger. So the Tuareg rebellions are essentially still happening. Mali came very close to collapse in 2012 because the Tuareg rebels, given the failure of previous negotiated settlements, embarked on an offensive that almost took the capital city of Bamako. Except the French launched an intervention called Operation Serval that prevented that from happening and saved the collapse of the Malian state. The Tuaregs were then sort of pushed back north, and in the mix of all that, Islamist insurgent groups kind of took advantage of a situation, took control of some of cities in northern Mali, and sort of launched their own campaign. So the main point here is there are a number of different secessionist conflicts ongoing in different ways in West Africa, and these are just prominent ones. So we also have Islamist insurgencies. Now, while there's a pretty old history of jihadist warfare in Sahelian Africa, in the 18th century, early 19th century, there's a wave of wars related to jihads that create new states, like the Sokoto Caliphate in northern Nigeria. There really is not much of a repeat of that for many, many years up until recently, up until the 21st century. There are a lot of Islamist groups, but eventually, as influenced by the kind of rise of global jihadism, Sahelian and Saharan Africa become what's now called the epicenter of Islamist, quote, terrorism, in quotation marks. So here is a map showing attacks by different Islamist insurgent groups in Mali and Niger, and getting down to Burkina Faso. The danger here is this is spreading south, and there's media reports now of Islamist groups staging out of northern Ghana. Ghana, a very stable country for many, many years, now could be drawn into this. And of course, over here you've got Islamist rebellion in northeast Nigeria. So let's just break it down a little bit further. So the main Islamist rebellions are in northern Nigeria, mostly northeast Nigeria, and there it involves the Boko Haram group. There's the former leader of Boko Haram, Abubakar Shekau, sorry. And that movement developed in, the war began in 2009 when the founder of Boko Haram, Mohammed Yusuf, was murdered by the Nigerian police. So the beginning of this insurgency is kind of a own goal on the part of the Nigerian security forces. This movement existed there earlier in the 2000s. It had a bad relationship with the state for sure, but it wasn't a war. But once the founder of the movement was killed by the police, then you have quite an intense conflict developing. So by the way, Boko Haram means Western education is forbidden. Boko actually means book, like a book written in Latin script, but it generally means kind of Westernization is not good, don't do it. So from 2009, there's an extremely violent Boko Haram insurgency in northeastern Nigeria that goes through various stages. First is centered on the city of Maiduguri, and it's a kind of urban conflict. When Boko Haram are expelled from Maiduguri around 2010, they go into the bush, and actually are pretty successful at transforming into a conventional military with motor vehicles, with vehicles captured from a Nigerian military, like that one back there in the video. And they start capturing territory. They start overrunning towns. They start capturing territory in some piece of forest, which is a part of the northeast there. And then around 2014, 2015, there's a big Nigerian military offensive against them. That period is when the famous or infamous Chibok kidnapping happened. Boko Haram took 272 schoolgirls from a school in Chibok, which is a small community up there. So once the Nigerian military launched its conventional offensive, essentially Boko Haram retreated to neighboring countries and then resorted to guerrilla warfare tactics. Along the way, sort of after that, a splinter group developed called ISWAP, Islamic State West Africa Province. So we kind of associate Islamic State with, super violence, right? News out of the Middle East recent years. In fact, ISWAP developed out of a disagreement within Boko Haram over violence towards civilians. The original Boko Haram was very, very brutal towards civilians, massacring civilians in their own area. ISWAP represented the guys who didn't want to do that, who saw that as counterproductive. You're killing the people you want to liberate and support, according to your view. So generally, ISWAP veered away from that kind of indiscriminate violence to focus more on fighting the Nigerian state. Although obviously, violence itself can be indiscriminate. So now ISWAP is a bit more prominent than Boko Haram. And you have this kind of insurgency that's being essentially confined to the Lake Chad area, which is an international area, right? This is northeast Nigeria, northern Cameroon, a bit of Niger, and Chad, around Lake Chad. So this is an area cut by colonial imposed borders, but in fact the people around Lake Chad have a common kind of culture, common languages, especially Kanuri, and Boko Haram operates in all those countries, but it's not really a transnational group, it's more of a Lake Chad group. And Lake Chad and northeast Nigeria is different than the rest of northern Nigeria. Different culture, different languages. That's probably why the rebellion has been mostly confined to that area. It's also a rebellion that doesn't have a lot of very prominent ties with other Islamist insurgencies. A little bit here and there, but not massive. Not in the way the Sahelian groups do. Probably because people in that Lake Chad area, especially northeast Nigeria, and this remains a very Nigerian kind of movement, they don't speak French in northeastern Nigeria. They do in the neighboring Francophone countries, but the Boko Haram people come from Nigeria, and they don't speak Arabic, not usually. So their links with Sahelian Islamist groups is sort of limited by that. It's a local thing, but it's a very intense, powerful, and ugly thing. So what can we say about Sahelian jihadists, the jihadist groups that have expanded, massively proliferated in Mali and Niger, and even getting into Burkina Faso? Well, there's so many of them, you can't really mention them all. There's dozens of them. They've sort of proliferated massively over the past 15 years or so. I mean, we used to be able to talk about Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb as one of the main groups there, but there's many more now. And the most prominent one now is JNIM. That's the society, the support group for Islam and Muslims, which is a sort of amalgamation of 3 or 4 smaller jihadist groups. They really gained momentum with the success of a Tuareg offensive in 2012. And then the French intervention. They kind of almost replaced the Tuaregs as the main purveyors of violence in the area, basically. And it's become a kind of separate issue now from the Tuareg issue, although sometimes they cooperate with the Tuareg, sometimes they don't. A few developments in neighboring countries kind of made the situation worse. One was an Algerian civil war up here in the 90s. So there were Islamist rebel groups fighting against the Algerian government. And when that civil war ended in the early 2000s with the victory of a government, a lot of Algerian Islamists went south into the Sahel, into Mali and Niger, and started kind of repeating there what they've done in Algeria. So these groups are pretty international based on, Maghreb, North Africa, and Sahelian Africa. Another important event that influenced their growth was the fall of a Gaddafi regime in Libya in 2011. Gaddafi had a lot of Malians and Nigerians in his Islamic Legion, and when the regime fell, they took their weapons and went home. That's not the only thing. I think that actually gets exaggerated a lot in commentary about these conflicts, but it is important. So there are a number of events getting into the early 21st century that gave these Islamist extremist groups a kind of momentum, kind of added strength, basically. And the states that they fight against are super weak. Mali, Niger, their armed forces are like 10, 20,000 each. Nigeria is 200,000. These are very weak states with weak armed forces. They're not able to contend with these insurgencies. So the French came in and tried to help them out. Operation Serval becomes Operation Barkhane. But the French have like a strong brigade for a place the size of Europe. 5,000 troops? What are they going to do? The UN comes in Mali, MONUSMA. A little bit bigger, ultimately the deadliest UN deployment ever. Still not really effective. So a vast area, groups engaged in hit and run kind of guerrilla warfare using vehicles like those Hiluxes I talked about. A lot of skills in desert warfare that they've kind of developed over the years and are now applying to motor vehicles and things. The one advantage that some of the states have is air power, because the insurgent groups do occasionally use drones, but the Nigerian Air Force, for instance, and other air forces there do have essentially a monopoly on air power. And the insurgents don't have a lot of air defense capability. But this airplane here is a good example of some of the problems of counterinsurgency warfare in West Africa. That's a Super Tucana counterinsurgency aircraft, Brazilian-US co-production. Very good counterinsurgency aircraft because, if you take a jet like a MiG-21 or something, it's quite old, it's meant to intercept bombers over the Arctic or something. It's no good at counterinsurgency warfare. It goes too fast. It can't see people on the ground. So you need something simple like this prop plane here. And that kind of use of small, slow aircraft in counterinsurgency campaigns is very old. This is a new version of that. It's slow and so on, slow enough to see and engage targets on the ground, but it has sort of modern avionics and sighting and weapons and things like that. The problem, though, it took a Nigerian Air Force a couple of years to get these things because of human rights abuses, allegedly, probably. The American government blocked the sale of those aircraft to Nigeria. But once they made it there, they did have an impact. It's kind of my last big point. The pressures created by all these conflicts and crises, plus add in the cost of living crisis and inflation, which people in poor countries don't have a kind of cushion to absorb, has led to a resurgence of military coups, particularly in Sahelian West Africa. Now, coups are not new in post-colonial African history. There have been many, many coups since the 1960s. The heyday of coups was about 1964, 66, up until about 1990 or so, kind of corresponding with the Cold War period. And West Africa had a lot of coups. Countries like Ghana and Nigeria had multiple coups, like 5, 6 coups each, plus some failed coup attempts. And in fact, one of the most written about topics in terms of African military studies for a long time was political scientists like Dr. Hubert writing about military coups in Africa. There were all sorts of theories about why they happened. Really good research done on that. Back in the 60s and 70s, some scholars praised them and said, well, you know, this is the warrior tradition in African culture coming to save the continent from instability. Trouble with looking at it like that is pretty much every military regime was a total disaster. Very oppressive, didn't solve any problems, made new problems. So there are different theories about military coups I don't really have time to get into. The main point is they were pretty common in 60s, 70s, 80s. They never fully disappeared from the African political scene, but getting into the early 21st century, it seemed like maybe they were a thing of the past. That there had been democratization in many countries, there were new constitutions, professionalization of the military, all kinds of different things. And of course, the new African Union, with in the early 2000s, the Organization of African Unity turned into the African Union. The old OAU didn't really care about coups, internal business. We're not interested in that. Many of the governments there were military ones anyway. But the African Union kind of got tougher on coups. This is criminal, we don't like this, and so forth. So we thought we saw the back of coups until about 2020, even a little bit before. And this is a nice map here for illustrating the point. All those countries in red have seen coups since 2020. Some have seen several. Burkina Faso has had 2 coups. Mali has had 2 coups. The rest have basically had 1. So some of these coups don't have that much to do with insurgencies and so on. Like the coup in Gabon is more like just a continuation of an old dictatorship. The coup in Guinea is also a little bit different. The 3 I'm most concerned about are the ones in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, where you have military governments coming into power. And here are the 3 leaders there. Assimi Goïta of Mali, Abdourahmane Chane of Niger. He's the old man of a group. He's like in his 60s. The rest are young guys. And Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. So there are military regimes in these 3 countries, these 3 here. So the emergence of these military regimes led to a few things. Firstly, it led to a splitting of a regional international governmental organization called ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, that had been established in 1975 to encourage development and economic cooperation and even security cooperation. And ECOWAS was very active in international military interventions in the 90s in Liberia and Sierra Leone. You can criticize them a lot, I think, but at least as a regional grouping, it was able to do that. Now, ECOWAS was not happy about military coups and regimes in some of its member states, so it started to suspend these states and get into diplomatic arguments with them. And the result was these 3 states, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, have broken off from ECOWAS and formed their own group called the Alliance of Sahelian States. What will happen with this remains to be seen, because if you look at the geography here, these are landlocked states. They're kind of dependent on the ports of the coastal states, still ECOWAS, so they can't really totally isolate themselves from the other West African states. But a separation has happened. And that separation leads to another change, and that is a change in external alliances. So all these new military regimes were really very anti-French, very anti-Western, very anti-UN. So you had French and UN forces in Mali, and the French forces are also into other countries. And ultimately, these regimes kicked out those forces. It's a little more complicated than that, but they leave. And then, well, these are still very weak states. They need external support because they're fighting multiple insurgencies with next to nothing. So who do they get to replace the French and the UN? Russia, of course. So Russia's history in Africa is really interesting. In Soviet times, the Soviet Union was very active in Africa, especially in the 70s and 80s. And it developed quite a positive reputation in many African countries because it supported liberation movements against stubborn holdout colonial regimes, white minority settler regimes, that sort of thing. And it had a very strong military presence, particularly in Angola and Ethiopia from 1975 to the end of the 80s. Then, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed. You know, Russia gets into turmoil and economic crisis. All that connection with Africa is lost. And because the Soviet Union's gone, the Americans and Western countries, they feel a bit less interested in supporting African governments and intervening in African affairs because there's no enemy, there's no rival anymore. So during the 90s, there's a kind of pull-out of, you could call great powers from Africa. There's a disinterest in it in the post-Cold War era. But then you have a resurgent Russia coming in and wanting to reestablish connections with African countries in the early 21st century, wanting, for instance, naval base facilities like they're going to establish in Port Sudan, wanting raw materials, wanting international diplomatic connections for votes in the UN and stuff like that. They want to come back to Africa. And they position themselves as the opposite of the neo-colonial French and the useless UN as they see it. So for these new military regimes that have alienated themselves from France and the UN, the Russian partners represent a good deal. And they have advantages that working with the French and UN don't offer. So the French and UN, particularly the UN, would worry about rules of engagement, human rights. They don't always succeed in these things. Not saying they're perfect, but the Russians don't care about that stuff. The Russian way of war is actually more similar to the African way of war. Don't worry about that stuff. Get the job done. Harsh thing to say, but I think it's true. And essentially, the Russians will send in PMCs, right? Private military contractors, the Wagner Group, which in a way are not really private military contractors. It's just an arm of a Russian state in a way. They're not like the classic PMCs of the 90s, like executive outcomes, that were actually businesses. This is part of Russian foreign policy, right? This is not really a private military company. It just pretends to be. So what they do is for access to mineral rights, for access to resources, they will come in and help out these governments. The way they do that is a little bit different than the UN and French who have been kicked out. Generally, the Russians focus mostly on coup-proofing the regime, on protecting the regime. But then they also offer, essentially, they serve as combat multipliers in engagements. They work with the local forces in offensives and operations against different types of insurgents, Tuaregs, Islamists, so on. Now when I wrote the description of this talk, which is going on too long, I It was a few months back, because we had to do the descriptions for all the talks for the year. At that moment, something interesting seemed to be happening, really interesting, because there was a battle in far north Mali, right up there on that corner. My hand's too shaky. And Tuareg separatists and allegedly some of the Islamist insurgents ambushed a Russian and Malian army column and obliterated them. They killed about 80-something of them. Big victory for insurgent forces up there. And at the time, it was reported in the media that this was enabled by Ukrainian intelligence, helped the insurgents to locate and ambush the force. And that is probably true. So it seemed the Ukrainian-Russian conflict was exported to Africa, kind of like the Cold War was exported to Africa. Now at the time it was like, wow, is this going to get worse? What's going to happen? And there were similar reports from the war in Sudan of Ukraine and Russia helping opposite sides. Since I wrote that description, not much else has happened on this front. Probably because Ukrainians are losing their own war, they have problems at home, they can't be bothered with Africa anymore, and they've left it to the Russians. So what we see here is a resurgence, a kind of new scramble for Africa, where after ignoring Africa for 10, 15 years, mostly in the 90s and early 2000s, great powers are interested in Africa again, primarily for resources, but also for diplomatic issues. Okay, last little thing. African solutions to African problems. Like what's the solution to all this? And this slogan has been popular for about 20, 30 years now. And it sounds good, right? Solve your own problems. And it comes out of a context where post-colonial Africa had a lot of solutions imposed on it in sort of the 80s, 90s. I'm thinking particularly of structural adjustment programs, kind of forced on African countries by international financial institutions like a World Bank and so on. So privatize your economy, devalue your currency, and it all led to disaster. It led to spiraling, terrible standards of living, basically. So in order not to be the subject of such impositions anymore, African leaders and others in other countries start talking about, let's have our own solutions to our own problems. And that sounds good. I mean, if you're not an African official, Europe or North America, and you say this, it's like, yeah, we don't have to bother with that place. Let them solve their own issues. If you're an African leader, this sounds really good because it's about sovereignty. It sounds good to the voters and to the public. We don't want foreign interference, and, that sort of thing. But is it realistic? Is it really realistic that Africa should solve its own problems? Are its problems the product of its own people? To some extent it is. I think Africa has had abysmal political leadership since independence. It just has. So Africans bear some responsibility for these problems, but certainly the structure these problems originate in, and even some of the very problems themselves, are not entirely the fault of Africans. I mean, it's kind of like, you go out there tonight after the talk, you're in the car park, someone attacks you, they kick the shit out of you, they steal your wallet, they steal your car keys, steal your car, go to your house, burn your house, and then someone says to you, you should solve your own problems. I mean, go get a car, get a job. Those borders I talked about at the beginning, no African had anything to do with deciding on those borders and all the problems that came with them. And that's just one issue. So at the same time, when I say this is not realistic, and others should be involved in solving these problems. I don't want to be confused. I'm not saying there should be UN interventions. I'm not saying there should be foreign interventions. They're disastrous. UN interventions in Africa particularly are useless. Part of the reason we have anti-Western sentiment in many Sahelian countries is, and other countries, is because you have a UN presence for like 20 years and it doesn't solve anything. And people say, what are these guys doing here? They're not doing anything. That's a problem in Eastern DRC recently. So that's not the problem. Big Western military interventions in Africa, also not the solution. They always go bad. And even African peacekeeping missions with mostly African troops go bad. So I don't really have a solution, but one thing I can say is it's time for people, Africans, non-Africans, leaders and others, business people, political people, to sit down and start coming up with out-of-the-box solutions for this stuff that doesn't just include Africa. African leaders won't like that because they'll see that as losing authority or neo-colonialism. Non-African leaders might not like that either, depending. So I'll just end it there. Sorry for going on too long, but I told you some of this stuff is complicated, and I guess we'll have questions.
Okay, so we'll follow the similar procedure that we have. We have 20 or so minutes. I think we have, yes. Please wait to get the mic so that we can hear you because we're recording. Of course, we're not recording me right now. But open up for questions for Dr. Stapleton. Over here.
You didn't have very much to say about Cameroon, Tim. Is Paul Biya still alive?
Supposedly, unless he's in a hospital in France somewhere. And he's been in there for, what, 40 years now? And he's not going to live forever. That's the trouble with these kind of lifetime presidencies. They do end ultimately, and then what happens next? It leads to kind of uncertainty. But the same regime could continue. Someone else could take over. And I'm not sure, you know, once I don't think his death or his removal from power will really change the situation for the Anglophone minority. Maybe. Now, that said, I don't support their secession. I don't think secession is a solution. I think they'd be much better in a reformed, bigger Cameroon state that has maybe human rights, democracy, responsible, sort of a responsible government sort of thing. Secessionism is just leading to violence, and the secessionists are so militarily weak, they have no chance. So they're just inviting violence upon their people for what I think is no good reason. It's just not justifiable. And I got in trouble with some Ambazonians a couple of years ago here. Just before the pandemic, we had some Ambazonian representatives visit the university, and you know, I asked something like, well, you guys are safe here, you know, but why are you coming here with your Ambazonian flag and kind of encouraging people back home to do things that are going to get them killed when you have no chance of winning? And they went crazy. Oh, we have a right to self-determination. Yeah, I guess you do, but if you can't actually get it, you're just going to suffer for years and years and years. Redirect your efforts towards reforming the state, which might seem very frustrating, but it's probably their only chance. And no one supports them really, only their own diasporic group. France certainly still supports the main Cameroon state. Nigeria is very anti-secession because it has its own secession issues. So you know, I think you're kind of hopeless, basically, and they should look for other methods. And I mean that of all the secessionist movements.
Hi, I'm curious about the Sahelian jihadist groups. You mentioned there was dozens of them, and I could see on the map there was many, many attacks. Is there a particular mechanism that prevents them from joining up with each other?
like a lot of religious movements, they have a tendency to split. I mean, you see this thing in Christian churches all the time, right? I'm the better one. I'm the better Christian. You're, a backslider. You're a screw-up. I'm the pure one. I'm going to go out and form my own group because you're nonsense. That's essentially what it is. They have a tendency to always hive off from each other. Might be a good thing because it's a really deep, profound kind of weakness. So yeah, that's essentially why. I think it's in the nature of such religious movements. And there are also different belief systems and identities within these groups as well that influence that.
That was a great talk. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I'd like to know more about perhaps the past, the present, and the future role of China in this area.
Very good question. One of the many things I didn't have time to get into. So, China, for the past 20 years or so, has had an increasing presence in Africa. Now, that's not entirely a new thing. China had relations with post-colonial African countries and liberation movements in the 60s and 70s. But then, of course, China had its own issues and kind of withdrew from Africa before the Soviet Union did a bit. But with the upsurge in China, increase in their economy, industrialization, they want raw materials. So generally, China has had an increased relationship, economic, diplomatic mostly, with many, many African countries, even Botswana, and not that much of a military relationship. Now, there's some exceptions to that. So in terms of Horn of Africa piracy crisis around 2010 or so, because that affected international shipping and China's a big exporter, they're pretty upset about that. So China participated in the international coalition against piracy off the Horn of Africa, representing the first overseas deployment of a Chinese Navy, or People's Liberation Army Navy, a weird term, representing the first deployment outside of our home waters since about 1410. So that's a long time. That's a big change, right? And China established a naval base in Djibouti to support that. And now, at the same time, while you don't see Chinese troops and things in Africa, usually, a lot of Chinese weapons being sold to Africa. And Chinese weapons are more affordable than those offered by other big powers. Whether or not they work well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Nigeria's bought a whole bunch of Chinese armored vehicles. And some of these are seeing their first combat deployments in northeast Nigeria, so we'll see how they do. But the main idea is they are cheap, and they seem to get the job done compared to like a Western tank or something that might be twice the cost. Another thing about China and Africa is it's similar to Russia, although the Russian engagement is much more militaristic. The Chinese engagement is also done without any concern about human rights records of partner governments in Africa. So they make for very convenient partners for African governments that are sensitive to what they see as foreign interference, judgments, impingement on their sovereignty, that kind of thing. They basically, their attitude is, you guys do your own thing, we're just coming here to mine copper or whatnot, and then, we go. It's just a business deal. There's also Chinese loans are a big thing in Africa, and because they're also loans that don't have similar conditions about human rights, but they're real loans. Often loans and financial deals from the West, they come with a lot of conditions, but they're not real loans. Like, you kind of don't have to pay them back. There are some repercussions for getting into debt, but generally you don't really have to pay them back. Nothing will immediately bad will happen to you. But if an African country gets into debt with China, say to build a port or something in East Africa, that's a real loan. And if the loan is not serviced and so on, China will take possession of the assets like the port facilities. So there's issues around sovereignty there. So it's part of this kind of, quote, new scramble for Africa, of great powers rediscovering Africa, generally for resources and extraction, things like that. Not much different than the first scramble for Africa. It was motivated by the same thing. Just different players, a more global set of players, even like Turkey and UAE and so on getting involved. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad you raised that. It's been a big factor in especially African economies for the past couple of decades or so. But China's military involvement directly has been very, very limited. You know, lots of weapons deals and stuff, but compared to the Russian engagement, you know, that's much more directly military often. China's also been looking for naval bases in Africa. There's a sort of desire to get an Atlantic naval base, and that just horrifies the Americans. It's like, oh my God, China's going to get a naval base in Equatorial Guinea. Oh, the world will never be the same. You know, yet it hasn't really transpired. Thanks for that.
More questions?
Just wondering about Canada's current position. I'm old enough to remember the Biafran Civil War, and Canada did not support Biafra because we didn't want to see anyone separating from the Confederation.
Quebec had something to do
Yes,
with that. We have our own Biafra.
Yes, I remember Canadians being horrified by the famine, which was in the media. But does Canada have much of an influence or position at all in Africa currently? And
you know, Canada's position on the Nigerian Civil War is interesting because you're right. Initially, Canada, like a lot of other countries, really hostile to Biafran separatism. And that's informed by our own separatist issues, right? And Trudeau, the older Trudeau famously said something like, "Where's Biafra?" Never heard of it. Of course he had. He's flippant. So, but ultimately, you know, Canada's position on Biafra changed during the Civil War. By 1970, Canada's involved in relief flights to Biafra, arguably prolonging the Civil War, but sort of bowing to public pressure that mounted because of Biafran PR campaign, focusing on genocide accusations and starving children. And you get the first TV images of African children with swollen bellies, the birth of Doctors Without Borders, that kind of thing. Biafra, you know, militarily was overwhelmed, but in terms of propaganda, wow, they were spectacular. You know, far ahead of the federal military government. And they convinced people in places like France, Ireland, Canada, US, to sort of pressure their governments to change, to sort of help them in different ways. Very effective in terms of propaganda. They hired a Swiss PR firm called Mark Press to do this. So I won't get into it, but Canada kind of changes a bit, kind of softens towards the end of the Nigerian Civil War. Now, in terms of the present situation, where you were asking about current Canadian policies towards Africa, I mean, Canada's engagement with Africa in terms of the government has certainly gone down in recent years. But I think the economic engagement has been quite robust. Canadian mining companies are really active in Africa, and it's not a well-known thing in Canada generally. And there's some of the most egregious in terms of not following environmental rules and bribing people and sort of making deals with authoritarian regimes, that kind of thing. And it's been an issue for quite a long time. Canada's military engagement, we're in the military museum, let's talk about the military, that's also changed over time. Canada used to be really active with helping African militaries in the 60s. So Canada was engaged with Tanzania in the 60s, helping to develop the Tanzanian People's Defense Force, and with Ghana. Very important in building training institutions, the first staff colleges, things like that. You had Canadian military personnel in Tanzania writing English instruction manuals for Chinese weapons. Because, you know, the Chinese ones, the Tanzanians didn't know anything about Chinese. Now, that's changed. The reason we're so active in Africa in the 60s was English speaking with a British derived military system like Africa, like Anglophone Africa, but not Britain, right? Not the former colonial power, but, you know, similar language and stuff like that. That's changed. Now it's become, oh, you're the guys with French, but you're not France. So there's been Canadian military relations with some of the Francophone states or Canadian troops in the Sahel region. Canada sent a helicopter medical unit to the UN force in Mali. That was part of the young Trudeau's return to peacekeeping sort of thing. But, you know, these are, of course, in the greater scheme of things, pretty small kind of engagements, basically. And I think there's a lot more going on back in the 60s, Canadian involvement in the Congo crisis, stuff like that. Of course, Canadians are no stranger to Africa. I mean, Canadians helped conquer Africa. The conqueror of Katanga, Stairs, was a Canadian from Halifax. He worked for Leopold II. He died in Katanga. Sir Percy Giroir was the first, I think, lieutenant governor of northern Nigeria. There's a Giroir building at RMC, right? So because of ties across the old British Empire, Canada has a lot of historical links to Africa. And indeed, fast forward decades, Canada has a lot of development and cultural and diplomatic ties with Africa because of the kind of British Commonwealth ties, because of La Francophonie, and international development assistance. Mali and Burkina Faso were huge recipients of Canadian development assistance. They're not anymore. So Canada has a history in Africa that goes back pretty far, and of course you've got, settlers, the black loyalists from Nova Scotia, I'm going way back now, 1790s. The black loyalists from Nova Scotia went and settled in Sierra Leone. There's lots of historical connections between Africa and Canada. People have forgotten it, but it's a very rich history, and it's still happening in a way.
Just wondering if, because, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa specifically, is projected to be like the epicenter of climate instability over the next 50, however many years, is all this insurgency, more coups, more instability, directly impacting, do you think or feel, the way that they're able to look at, plan for, adapt to climate change? And of course you've got like transnationals making things worse at the same time, but like climate change is a threat multiplier is something that we looked at around Lake Chad and other places, so.
Yeah, Lake Chad has shrunk a lot in the past few decades, but there are actually debates about this and the impact of climate change. So, the traditional view of the last few decades has been, there's been a desertification. The spreading of a Sahara, drying out of a Sahel leads to less usable land. So then you get clashes, communities fight over this land. And that's often expressed as herder-farmer conflict, which happened in Western Canada too, probably at some point. But you have farmer communities fighting with pastoralist livestock communities over this diminishing amount of land. And it sort of superimposes itself on all the conflicts I'm talking about. It's part of a bigger conflict, but it's very local too. Actually, kind of in terms of rushing, I skipped over something I wanted to say about militia groups in the Sahel, that they become, self-defense militia groups have become quite common, but they're also become actors in these kind of conflicts, like herder-farmer conflicts. And then stereotypes about things like terrorism, in quotation marks, becomes part of that. So, for instance, the Fulani people of West Africa, who are pastoralists across many different countries, have become kind of associated with Islamist terrorism. They're painted with this terrorist brush. They're all terrorists, sort of thing. And that means they're therefore the enemies of everyone else. And that leads to violence between some of the farming communities and them. So there's, in Mali, a lot of violence between Dogon people who are farmers and Fulani who are sort of semi-nomadic pastoralists, with this desertification issue perhaps influencing it. Now here's the debate part. Desertification of a Sahel might not be true, might not be accurate, because recently there's some literature, like credible literature, saying there's a greening of a Sahel. There's a greening of a Sahara happening in the last few years. So actually you don't have this, in a lot of areas, this idea of diminishing fertile land and spread of desert and things, that there's other reasons for conflict. So as you get a greening of a Sahel, you have worse conflict. So maybe environmental change is not related, or not entirely related, or not in a kind of simple way to these conflicts. I'm not sure if that's true or not about the greening of a Sahel. I mean, I'm not a climate scientist, but I know there's serious people talking about this. It's not climate denial stuff. And in some areas you get that desertification, in other areas you don't. Lake Chad, yeah, I mean, you can go online and look up maps of Lake Chad over different periods. 100 years ago was big. It's smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Fishing communities and so on suffer, and there's less and less ways to make a living, to survive. So people maybe look for other ways. But at the same time, that area has been kind of violent for a very long time. There's a pretty thriving slave trade there, even into the 1920s. 1920s. So some scholars I'll put in a plug for my late colleague Nick David from Anthropology Archaeology. You see, he worked in the Mandara Mountains in northeast Nigeria, and he saw a lot of similarities between the Boko Haram violence and earlier slave raiding going on in that area. It's almost like old practices were coming back rather than entirely new thing. So the relation of climate change is problematic. The conflict in the area is problematic, is debated, is contested. We don't really know.
Okay, we have time for one last question, and then we'll have to go into our informal session.
Thank you for the lecture. I just have a question about some of the smaller West African countries. For instance, the country of Guinea-Bissau. The president recently came out and said that the country's in institutional crisis, and some reports are saying that it's on the brink of authoritarianism. The president also postponed...
Brink was crossed a while back, I think.
The president, postponed the election, and ECOWAS withdrew. And at the same time, he met with Putin last month to discuss future partnerships, including minerals deals. Do you foresee any of these smaller, more vulnerable West African states following the Sahel states in leaving ECOWAS or embracing Russian influence?
It could be, but I don't think there's a lot of signs of that right now. And you have a military government, a new one in Guinea, and they haven't done that at all. They talk a bit to the Russians, but they still talk a bit to the French. And generally there's this kind of anti-French sentiment across the former French colonies now. Even Senegal, which was the quintessential France-Afrique state, has told the French to take their troops home. But the French businesses will stay, diplomats and things like that. For Guinea-Bissau, it's a former Portuguese colony. It's a little bit different than other West African states. After independence in 1974, it becomes an authoritarian state, a very troubled state, and a narco state. Drug smuggling becomes the big thing for Guinea-Bissau. So, and this was another thing I didn't really have time to get into, or we'll be here all night. that smuggling in West Africa is superimposed in all these conflicts as well. I'm glad you brought it up, essentially, that as the international drug trade has changed, as it's become very difficult for drugs to get transported from sort of production areas in like South America, Central America, right to Europe, the route for drug smuggling has changed from South America to West Africa, across the Sahara to Europe. And there's a lot of different countries that have been affected by that. Guinea-Bissau is a good example, and an early example. The thing with the small states is, I think, if they were to break from ECOWAS, they would lose a lot out of it. They wouldn't gain that much. I see most of the coastal states staying with it, although, yeah, you'll get some trying to balance Russia against Western countries to get the best deal. That's been happening in post-colonial African history since independence. Tanzania balancing China and Canada even back in the 60s. So, it's hard to predict the future. I'm an historian. We really shy away from that. Political scientists like Dr. Hubert just love that crystal ball in his pocket up there. Republic of Benin, for instance, recently, because of the, it extends pretty far north, even though it's thin. It gets up towards the Sahelian area, and they've been having some issues with Islamist insurgents crossing over. One potential solution that they tried to do was to contract Rwanda to send troops to protect them, because Rwanda is the best military power in Africa right now, and by far. Tiny little country, punches way above its weight. It's got troops deployed in many different countries. They're very competent. That one didn't develop really for Benin. It's developed for Central African Republic and other places and so forth. But it shows you that, well, they're trying to think of different security partners, ones that might be a bit more competent than the regional ones, or a bit more, capable than the regional ones. Anything else?
I think that takes us to the time. We can have, first of all, as I told you, one of Canada's outstanding experts on African security. Thank you very much.
Thank you.